research.
Well, we can't talk about sleep without mentioning light from screens, artificial light, whether it's TVs, laptops, tablets, smartphones. There's been so much debate about how much these are now being used just before bed, particularly by children. And you've been researching this for a long time, decades, all the way back to your time in Groningen in the 80s. But back then, no one believed that light could affect the circadian cycle. But you showed that it did.
So back in the 1980s, people were skeptical about the role of light. And when it was accepted that light had an effect on circadian rhythms in humans, it was believed that very bright light was required. And you could go to meetings and people were explaining this to the audience in a lecture hall. And they would say, well, from a biological perspective or from a circadian perspective, we are sitting here in complete darkness. We now know that ordinary room light, has an effect on the circadian clock, which is of 50% of the maximum effect of light. So the human clock is very sensitive to light. It's so sensitive that indeed, and this has been shown experimentally, lights from screens can shift the clock. And this, of course, now is important in the context of what are we doing in the evening, what are children doing in the evening, what are adolescents doing in the evening, how much extra light are we exposed to, and what are the consequences of that.
Yeah, so artificial light does have a lot to answer for. You've done a lot of work on sleep patterns in older people. Now, there are a lot of myths. You've actually gone and removed and busted. A common notion, for example, is that as you get older, you need to have naps during the day. But it turns out that's not true, is it?
Yeah, there are myths around aging and sleep. And many people would say, well, when you are older, of course, you are more sleepy during the day and will take naps and you just need to live with it. So we did a study quite a few years ago now where we compared people in their 20s, in their 40s, and above 65. And they were in bed for 8 hours. And then we measured how sleepy they were during the day. And you can measure this by conducting what is referred to as a multiple sleep latency test. How long does it take you to fall asleep when I ask you to take a nap? And do this 5 times per day. And that's a gold standard test to assess sleep drive or sleep propensity. And it's, for example, used to identify people who are excessively sleepy because they have sleep apnea. So if you do this in the young, the middle-aged, and the older people, you will actually find that the young people who are sleepiest and the older people are most alert. And that finding has been replicated. Also, when you keep young and older people awake, ask them to pull an all-nighter, you will see that the younger people struggle much more than the older people. If you go on a bus trip to France and it's an overnight drive and you have the choice between a young, experienced driver and an older, experienced driver, you definitely should choose the older, experienced driver. Not because of the experience, but because when you're older, it's easier to stay awake during the night, and it's also easier to stay awake during the day. Now, that finding, we say, okay, so what? I think the important part of the important implication of that finding is that when you are older and you feel sleepy during the day, then it's not because you're older, but it's because something is wrong. It may be because you have a sleep disorder, or it may be because you have another underlying health condition that makes you sleepy. And that's just one example of how relatively simple findings can have an impact.
And more recently, Dirk-Jan Dijk, you've started to study the sleep patterns in people with dementia. Tell me what happens here.
Well, sleep and dementia is an important area. We know that certain sleep disorders are predictive of cognitive decline, like, for example, sleep apnea, where people stop breathing repeatedly during sleep. That is a risk factor for dementia. We also know that if you have less of rapid eye movement sleep, that's one of the 2 main sleep stages, that is a risk factor for developing dementia. And then we know that when dementia has developed, people living with dementia experience a range of sleep disturbances. And that may vary from going to sleep very early, let's say 7 p.m. in the morning, to going to sleep at a more or less normal time, but waking up repeatedly during the night and wander around in the house. And there are other disturbances as well, like extensive and very long daytime naps. So there are these sleep patterns, these sleep disturbances in dementia, and we want to find out to what extent sleep disturbances predict cognitive decline, but we also want to find out how variation in these sleep disturbances, night-to-night variation, associates with day-to-day variation in performance, behavior, and clinical measures. And by approaching this particular problem in this way, we hope to come up with interventions to reduce those sleep disturbances.
So what sort of interventions are you talking about here? How can you actually, in practice, help people in this state?
Well, if people are spending long periods in bed, and we're talking here about 10 or 11 hours, it may very well be that the intervention is going to be ask them to spend fewer hours in bed. One good way to ruin a good night's sleep is by spending too much time in bed. And so that's one example of an intervention. It is already in many care homes. Carers using common sense know that it's important to keep the residents in those care homes active and awake during the day, because then their sleep will be less disturbed. If they take these extended naps during the day, their nocturnal sleep will be disrupted. And that's an example of an intervention. What we're trying to do is develop methods by which we can monitor the sleep patterns and the behavioral patterns and other symptoms in individuals, and then develop individualized interventions and say that for this person living with dementia, this intervention is likely to have the most beneficial effects, whereas for another person, another intervention may be more appropriate. And nowadays, with new technologies, monitoring and long-term monitoring of sleep-wake patterns is becoming easier. New technologies allow already for contactless monitoring of sleep-wake patterns, or at least rest activity patterns. So it's much easier to collect long data streams, which will allow us to discover those regularities, but also these interrelations between sleep and daytime behaviors. And agitation can be a problem in dementia. Can we understand what triggers agitation? Is it related to any aspect of sleep-wake timing or sleep disturbances? Is it related to time of day? And that's the direction in which we are currently going.
And zooming out, Dirk-Jan, given all the work you've done over the years trying to understand the nature and mechanisms of sleep, what would you say are the outstanding questions that you'd most like to find an answer to?
Well, one outstanding question is what makes a good night's sleep? And you may be surprised that we don't have the answer to that, but I don't think we have the answer. And I've done some research in this area, and other researchers have addressed that question as well. It's not so easy to find a physiological correlate of what you have experienced as a good night's sleep. We all know this was a good night, this was a bad night, but I can't tell you which aspect of physiology caused you to report that you had a good night's sleep. So that would be kind of a nice thing to find out, and it may be that new monitoring techniques will help us to get an answer to that question.
Well, my Fitbit gives me a score for the quality of my sleep when I wake up in the morning. A lot of people these days, who wear smartwatches and Fitbits to bed can absolutely get obsessed with how much sleep they're getting, of what quality. I know these devices measure our heart rate and they measure motion, how restless we are in bed. But of course, they're not measuring brain waves, or they're not measuring core body temperature, which I know are both important. So how reliable, if my Fitbit tells me I've got a score of 86 because I've got X minutes of slow wave, deep sleep, and X minutes of REM sleep, how to what extent should I believe it?
So within the research we are doing in the context of the Dementia Research Institute, we're looking quite extensively at the validity and reliability of technologies, including wearables such as Fitbits, although we haven't tested that particular device. Our data so far tell us that these numbers coming out of those devices are not that reliable at all. I wear a wearable, and for the past 2 years, every morning it tells me that I had 0 minutes of rapid eye movement sleep, which is the sleep stage during which we dream a lot. And I know I've had many dreams.
Right.
So I don't need that device to tell me that much about my sleep, because it is not reliable.
That's probably quite reassuring for a lot of people who are worried that it tells me I've only had 2 minutes of deep sleep. Oh no, I must feel really
exactly.
rough. And okay, finally, Dirk-Jan, what keeps you awake at night?
So usually I don't talk about my personal sleep and sleep habits. I think I'm not going to deviate from that tradition, but it's clear that when you do research about sleep and what keeps people awake at night, it is indeed